Hey y'all, welcome to Hands on Books. I've been meaning to make this episode for a while, covering some books that I got in Portugal from a recent trip. So I'm going to get to those, but first I want to open one new book that I know what it is. This is The Day After Judgment by James Blish, the sequel to Black Easter that I read recently and I loved it. Black Easter is sort of I guess it's like a religious fantasy novel where the church has like good magicians who interact with and sort of invoke like angelic or angels, like positive supernatural beings, and then there's also like black magicians that invoke demons and stuff. So it was really fun. I never read anything by Blish before, but I wanted to try the sequel out. I'm not going to read the description because it kind of spoils Black Easter. So if the first page of this spoils Black Easter, then I'm just going to read the first page of Black Easter. Yeah, this gives away too much. I'm just going to read the beginning of Black Easter. So I forget, this is split up into multiple stations, he calls them. So this is the first page of preparation of the operator. The room stank of demons, and it was not just the room, which would have been unusual, but not unprecedented. Demons were not welcome visitors on Monte Albano, where the magic practiced was mostly of the kind called transcendental, aimed at pursuit of a more perfect mystical union with God and his two revelations, the scriptures and the world. But occasionally, ceremonial magic, an applied rather than a pure art, seeking certain immediate advantages, was practiced also. And in the course of that the white monks sometimes called down a demiurge, and, even more rarely, raised up one of the fallen. That had not happened in a long time, however. Of that, Father F.X. Domenico Bruno Gorelli was now positive. No, the stench was something in the general air. It was, in fact, something that was abroad in the world, the secular world, God's world, the world at large. And it would have to be something extraordinarily powerful, extraordinarily malign, for Father Domenico to have detected it without prayer, without ritual, without divination, without instruments or instrumentalities of any kind. Though Father Domenico, ostensibly an ordinary Italian monk of about 40, I guess that means years, with the stolid face of his peasant family and calluses on his feet, was in fact an adept of the highest class, the class called Carcists. He was not a sensitive. There were no true sensitives at all on the mountain, for they did not thrive even in the relative isolation of a monastery. They could not function except as eremites, which explained why there were so few of them anywhere in the world these days. Father Domenico closed the huge book of hours with a creak of leather and parchment, and rolled up the palimpsest upon which he had been calculating. There was no doubt about it. None of the white monks had invoked any infernal power, not even a minor seneschal, for more than a 12-month past. He had suspected as much. How, after all, could he have gone unaware of such an event? But the records, which kept themselves without possibility of human intervention, confirmed it. That exhalation from hell-mouth was drifting up from the world below. Yeah, I love this book. Definitely check it out if you are into that sort of thing. Although it's pretty unique, I'm not sure how you'd be into it already. Anyway, I visited in Porto this cool bookstore called Livraria Lello. And it's probably, it's the most beautiful bookstore I've ever been in my life. Kind of tourist trappy because they charge you an admission fee, but then that can go towards books. There are a ton of other amazing little bookstores in Porto. If you speak Portuguese, they're really fun to go in and talk to the owners. One of them was this one, Livraria Ferreira, and another one was Livraria Alfarabista. Alfarabista. This lady was really nice. But those smaller bookstores don't often have a lot of like English books. So I took to collecting a bunch of bookmarks from museums and stuff. Got some cool ones here. But anyway, at Livraria Lello, I bought, or it was my birthday when I was there, so a bunch of my family ended up spending their entrance fee, getting me these little books, these cloth-bound books, and I love them so much. They fit in your pocket, and I read one of them while we were there. I'll start with Frankenstein, which I finished recently, and, you know, not breaking any new ground with this, but obviously what a masterpiece. And I'm amazed that she could write something. I think she, maybe 20 years old around there when she wrote this. Just incredible. And I love the feel of these tiny miniature cloth-bound books. So I think I marked a spot in here to read. Frankenstein, if you haven't read it before, has this amazing frame where the story is introduced by way of these letters from an adventurer trying to chart some course in the North Pole. Letters back to his sister describing how he found this guy on an ice floe adrift and going to die for sure, and they took him on board. And then the rest of the book is a sort of transcription of this guy's story, and the guy is Frankenstein, the doctor. And before they find the guy on the ice floe, they see this figure in the distance, like a huge figure in skins behind a team of dogs pulling him on a sled. And then he just sort of disappears. And then they find Frankenstein floating on the ice floe, and then eventually nurse him back to health, and he relates his story. So this is a spot that I marked because it's where the monster eventually gets to tell his story. And, I have this cultural idea of what the Frankenstein monster was, and he's this slow-moving, like, almost brain-dead thing. And in this, he's, like, superhuman and can, bound up a mountainside and extremely strong and completely the opposite of the depictions that I was familiar with. And it definitely makes the character more interesting and scary, I guess. So here we go. It is with considerable difficulty that I remember the original era of my being. All the events of that period appear confused and indistinct. A strange multiplicity of sensations seized me, and I saw, felt, heard, and smelt at the same time, and it was, indeed, a long time before I learned to distinguish between the operations of my various senses. By degrees, I remember, a stronger light pressed upon my nerves, so that I was obliged to shut my eyes. Darkness then came over me and troubled me, but hardly had I felt this when, by opening my eyes, as I now suppose, the light poured in upon me again. I walked and, I believe, descended, but I presently found a great alteration in my sensations. Before, dark and opaque bodies had surrounded me, impervious to my touch or sight. But I now found that I could wander on at liberty, with no obstacles which I could not either surmount or avoid. The light became more and more oppressive to me, and the heat wearying me as I walked. I sought a place where I could receive shade. This was the forest near Ingolstadt, and here I lay by the side of a brook resting from my fatigue, until I felt tormented by hunger and thirst. This roused me from my nearly dormant state, and I ate some berries which I found hanging on the trees or lying on the ground. I slaked my thirst at the brook, and then, lying down, was overcome by sleep. It was dark when I awoke. I felt cold also, and half frightened as it were, instinctively, finding myself so desolate. Before I had quitted your apartment, on a sensation of cold, I had covered myself with some clothes, but these were insufficient to secure me from the dews of night. I was a poor, helpless, miserable wretch. I knew, and could distinguish, nothing, but feeling pain invade me on all sides, I sat down and wept. Soon a gentle light stole over the heavens, and gave me a sensation of pleasure. I started up and beheld a radiant form rising from among the trees. I gazed with a kind of wonder. It moved slowly, but it enlightened my path, and I again went out in search of berries. I was still cold when under one of the trees I found a huge cloak with which I covered myself, and sat down upon the ground. No distinct ideas occupied my mind. All was confused. I felt light and hunger and thirst and darkness. Innumerable sounds rang in my ears, and on all sides various scents saluted me. The only object that I could distinguish was the bright moon, and I fixed my eyes on that with pleasure. Yeah, it's just amazing, this story, how he nests multiple narratives within them. You have like the ultimate frame, which is this sailor's story, recounting Frankenstein's story, and then nested within Frankenstein's story is the monster story. Anyway, on to the next one. I read this one while I was in Portugal, a collection of Herman Melville's short stories. And Bartleby the Scrivener was in this one, which I thought was confusing and awesome. And I my first sort of introduction to Melville, I tried to read Moby Dick a long when I was a kid, and I remember having some experience, like I got to page like 100 and they were just leaving the shore, and I think I was just thought it wasn't moving too fast and I was in the mood for more action. But Bartleby the Scrivener was great, but I think I'm going to read the beginning of Cock-A-Doodle-Doo, or the crowing of the noble cock Beneventano. In all parts of the world, many high-spirited revolts from rascally despotisms had of late been knocked on the head. Many dreadful casualties, by locomotive and steamer, had likewise knocked hundreds of high-spirited travelers on the head. I lost a dear friend in one of them. My own private affairs were also full of despotisms, casualties, and knockings on the head. When early one morning in spring, being too full of hypos to sleep, I sallied out to walk on my hillside pasture. It was a cool and misty, damp, disagreeable air. The country looked underdone, its raw juices squirting out all around. I buttoned out this squitchy air as well as I could with my lean, double-breasted dress coat. My overcoat being so long-skirted, I only used it in my wagon, and spitefully thrust my crabstick into the oozy sod, bent my blue form to the steep ascent of the hill. This toiling pasture brought my head pretty well earthward, as if I were in the act of butting it against the world. I marked the fact, but only grinned at it with a ghastly grin. Really cool stuff. All around me were tokens of a divided empire. The old grass and the new grass were striving together. In the low, wet swales, the verdure peeped out in vivid green. Beyond, on the mountains, lay light patches of snow, strangely relieved against their russet sides. All the humped hills looked like brindled kine in the shivers. The woods were strewn with dried dead boughs, snapped off by the riotous winds of March, while the young trees skirting the wood were just beginning to show the first yellowish tinge of the nascent spray. I sat down for a moment on a great rotting log nigh the top of the hill, my back to a heavy grove, my face presented toward a wide sweeping circuit of mountains, enclosing a rolling, diversified country. Along the base of one long range of heights ran a lagging, fever and aguish river, over which was a duplicate stream of dripping mist, exactly corresponding in every meander with its parent water below. A great image and description. Low down, here and there, shreds of vapor listlessly wandered in the air, like abandoned or helmless nations of ships, or very soaky towels hung on crisscross clotheslines to dry. Afar, over a distant village lying in a bay of the plain formed by the mountain, there rested a great flat canopy of haze like a pall. It was the condensed smoke of the chimneys, with the condensed exhaled breath of the villagers, prevented from dispersion by the imprisoning hills. It was too heavy and lifeless to mount of itself, so there it lay, between the village and the sky, doubtless hiding many a man with the mumps, and many a queasy child. Just incredible. Oh my God. I'm going to have to give Moby Dick another shot. I think it's time. Next on, I haven't really read any of this selected weird tales by Lovecraft. I've read At the Mountains of Madness, but I understand that I hear that Lovecraft is really at his best in the sort of short story format. So I'm excited to read some of these. This is just the first page of one. Which one is this? The Moon Bog from 1921. Somewhere, to what remote and fearsome region I know not, Dennis Barry has gone. I was with him the last night he lived among men, and heard his screams when the thing came to him. But all the peasants and police in County Meath could never find him, or the others, though they had searched long and far. And now I shudder when I hear the frogs piping in swamps, or see the moon in lonely places. I had known Dennis Barry well in America, where he had grown rich, and had congratulated him when he bought back the old castle by the bog at sleepy Kildare. It was from Kildare that his father had come, and it was there that he wished to enjoy his wealth among ancestral scenes. Men of his blood had once ruled over Kildare and built and dwelt in the castle, but those days were very remote, so that for generations the castle had been empty and decaying. After he went to Ireland, Barry wrote me often, and told me how under his care the grey castle was rising tower by tower to its ancient splendor, how the ivy was climbing slowly over the restored walls as it had climbed so many centuries ago, and how the peasants blessed him for bringing back the old days with his gold from over the sea. But in time there came troubles, and the peasants ceased to bless him, and fled away instead as from a doom. And then he sent a letter and asked me to visit him, for he was lonely in the castle, with no one to speak to save the new servants and laborers he had brought from the north. The bog was the cause of all these troubles, as Barry told me the night I came to the castle. I had reached Kildare in the summer sunset, as the gold of the sky lighted the green of the hills and groves and the blue of the bog, where on a far islet a strange olden ruin glistened spectrally. That sunset was very beautiful, but the peasants at Ballylough had warned me against it and said that Kildare had become accursed, so that I almost shuddered to see the high turrets of the castle gilded with fire. Barry's motor had met me at the Ballylough station, for Kildare is off the railway. The villagers had shunned the car and the driver from the north, but had whispered to me with pale faces when they saw I was going to Kildare. And that night, after our reunion, Barry told me why. The peasants had gone from Kildare because Dennis Barry was to drain the great bog. For all his love of Ireland, America had not left him untouched, and he hated the beautiful wasted space where peat might be cut and land opened up. The legends and superstitions of Kildare did not move him, and he laughed when the peasants first refused to help, and then cursed him and went away to Ballylough with their few belongings as they saw his determination. In their face he sent for laborers from the north, and when the servants left he replaced them likewise, but it was lonely among strangers, so Barry had asked me to come. I'm guessing something happens with the bog. That was great writing, though. I enjoyed it. This is The Maias by Queiroz. Something like that. I never heard of him, so I'll read this little introduction here. Queiroz, writing as if having the entire Portuguese language at his mercy, applies his immense literary genius to tell us about 19th century Portugal as if telling us about Portugal today and perhaps also that of tomorrow. The great Portuguese realist novelist was able to talk about themes such as abortion, clerical celibacy, the awe of the newly rich and recently educated before other civilizations, careerist blind loyalties, and, among the many other subjects he unfurled in all their cruelty, the somewhat illusionary separation between the urban and the rural belonging of the very same human genre. Born prior to the wedding of his parents, in a period when social constraints limited social rising to those born in wedlock, he nevertheless did not remain in Póvoa de Varzim, the place of his birth, embarking on an intense and important diplomatic career, crucial to him conveying to the world what he had to say about the always paradoxical fascination of being Portuguese. Chapter 1. Okay, this is going to be a lot of Portuguese pronunciation, so apologies in advance. When the Maias took up residence on Rua de São Francisco de Paula in Lisbon in autumn 1875, their house was known as the House of Hamulete, or simply Hamulete, throughout the surrounding Janelas Verdes neighborhood. Despite the freshness of this rural-sounding name, Hamulete was a somber and stone-walled house with a steady row of narrow iron balconies lining the first floor with a discreet line of small windows sheltering under the edge of the roof and bearing the downbeat appearance of an ecclesiastic residence typical of those built during the reign of Queen Maria I, topped with the bell and the cross that resembled a Jesuit college. The name Hamulete, meaning bouquet, had most certainly derived from the square panel of glazed tiles in the place that should have borne a heraldic coat of arms, but that which had never actually been installed, and instead depicting a large bunch of sunflowers tied together with a ribbon that displayed letters and the numbers of a date. Those are some long sentences. Hamulete had been left uninhabited for years, with thick spider webs covering the bars on the ground floor shutters, and the grounds inundated to verge on ruin. In 1858, Monsignor Bucarini, the nuncio of His Holiness, had visited with a view to installing the nunciature there, seduced both by the clerical gravity of the building and the sleep peace of the neighborhood. He also liked the inner areas, with their palatial layout, paneled ceilings, and fresco-covered walls, with their already faded garland roses and little cupid faces. However, the Monsignor, with his habits of any wealthy Roman prelate, needed the trees and waters of a luxury garden in his villa, and Hamulete managed only, at the bottom of its brick terrace, a poor and uncultivated patch of scrub, given over to wild weeds, with but a cypress, a cedar, a small dried-up cascade, a stagnant tank, and a marble statue, which Monsignor immediately recognized as Venus of Cythera, fading in one corner, attacked by the stealthy humidity of the wild bushes. Moreover, the rent demanded by old Villasa, the administrator and overseer to the Maias, seemed so exorbitant to the Monsignor that he, smiling, inquired whether Villasa thought the church was still living the times of Leo X. Villasa replied that the nobility was also no longer living the times of King João V, and thus Hamulete remained uninhabited. This useless derelict place, as Villasa Junior referred to it, he who had now become the overseer of the Maias' estate following the death of his father, would only be put to use in 1870 to store the furniture and china belonging to the family mansion in Benfica, an almost historic abode which, after being on sale for years, had been purchased by a Brazilian commander. Around that time, Tojeda, another estate belonging to the Maias, had also been sold off. A few members of the Lisbon elite, those who still remembered the Maias and knew that they had retired to their Santo Olavia estate on the banks of the river Douro at the time of the regeneration, inquired of Villasa whether the family was in distress. "They do still have some bread to eat," Villasa responded with a smile, "and a little butter to spread over it." And last up, we have the Lusiads by Luís de Camões. And this is like an epic poem about Portugal's, global exploration would be a nice way of putting it. I'll just read a little bit about him. Little do we know with certainty about the author of the Lusiads. Among it is the date when the poem that was destined to become a nation's insignia was published. Camões published it after his return from the East, where he spent 17 years of adventures and miseries, each evoked in some known stages of his epic. The year is 1572, the moment where the empire the Portuguese established in the East at the beginning of the 16th century shows obvious signs of depletion and even downfall. Camões met it in the light of this twilight. His poem shows the signs of this imperial autumn particularly evident for being the opposite of an ancient splendor that had not totally faded yet. Faith left up to him the task of assembling together, when it was still possible to do so, the utmost accomplishments of this extraordinary empire, the first in the West, founded, maintained for over half a century, thousands of leagues away from the Atlantic shores by a small European people. More than the Portuguese nautical accomplishments, even more than the conquest and the warlike and commercial presence in the Indian Ocean from Ormuz to Malacca, what impelled Camões to write his poem was the awareness he had of the gap between the novelty and the greatness of the Lusitanian undertaking and the weakness of the little kingdom that dared to imagine it and carry it out. Only a Portuguese and a poet running away from the bitter and exhilarating knowledge of this weakness, almost madness, could give his people's historical achievements the entirely new, epical, and even odd expression we find in the Lusiads. Effectively, the Lusiads are in many ways a unique epic poem, only to the Portuguese, especially since the poem became their sublime image. The awareness Camões had of the giant gap between the means and the results of the Portuguese adventure is not surprising. And, however, it was from that amazement that Camões's poem could emerge and therefore assume its epopee nature, nostalgic and voluntarist at the same time. In themselves, the Portuguese nautical accomplishments, achieved over the course of more than a century, were naturally epic, not only to the chroniclers that wrote about them, from Zurara to João de Barros, but to the European public opinion, already enticed by everything new and prompted by the universal curiosity of the Renaissance. A great number of humanists, national or foreign, made themselves available to the kings of Portugal to write their own epic interpretation according to ancient canons. Had they been well succeeded, we would have today, without a doubt, great machines of poetic rhetoric in which the Renaissance specialized. But we wouldn't have had the Lusiads. Camões knew how to fulfill those same machines with real poetry changing from within the completely formal perspective those same humanists could have of the great Portuguese accomplishments. To them, those fears didn't have a real subject. Camões's outlook gave them one by writing these facts on a story lived both at a personal and national level. He kept the abstract and literary universality of the Renaissance, inflating it with a new sort of patriotic passion that he personally assumed and very suitably came up with. His poem is not only evoked, as he says, by a love for his homeland so pure and almost eternal that it does not seek a reward, but by the almost romantic consciousness of a connection of that poem with the author himself. In fact, as much as the spirit of the time allowed, beyond that glorified heroes in Vasco da Gama's voyage to India, which is the common thread in the narrative's symbolic object, the Lusiad's real hero is the poet himself. Better yet, the sovereign voice which, from the first to last stanza, serves as the poem's basis, giving it a rhythm and a tone continuously epic and lyric, a peculiar combination on such a conventional genre like an epopee. Certainly Ariosto's example, once dominant, could allow all freedoms, but in his poem, specifically meant to get away from that heroic canto model on a marvelous and chivalresque style, things happened in a different way. Camões claims to his poem, by contrasting it with other epic narratives more or less fabulous of that era, the status of truth's chant. Addressing to Dom Sebastião, Portuguese's young king meant to be a legendary figure, the poet assures the truthfulness of his chant. Hark! For with vauntings vain thou shalt not view fantastical, fictitious, lying deed of lieges lauded as strange muses do, seeking their fond and foolish pride to feed. Thine acts so forceful are, told simply true, all fabled dreamy feats they far exceeding Rhodomont and Ruggiero vain, and Roland haply born of poet's brain. Okay, let's give it a shot. It's always nicer to read these without the covers. Canto 1. The feats of arms and famed heroic host, from Occidental Lusitanian strand, who o'er the waters ne'er by seamen crossed, fared beyond the Taprobane land, forceful in perils and in battle post, with more than promised force of mortal hard, and in the regions of a distant race reared a new throne so hot in pride of place. And, eke, the kings of memory grand and glorious, who hide them holy faith and reign to spread, converting, conquering, and in lands notorious, Afrique and Asia, devastation made. Nor less the lieges who by deeds memorious break from the doom that binds the vulgar dead. My song would sound o'er earth's extremest part, where mine the genius, mine the poet's art. Cease the sage Grecian, and the man of Troy to vaunt long voyage made in bygone day. Cease Alexander, Trajan cease to joy the fame of victories that have passed away. The noble Lusian's stouter breast sing I, whom Mars and Neptune dared not disobey. Cease all that antique muse hath sung, for now a better bravery rears its bolder brow. Just a few more. I'd have to read this slower to really follow what it all means, but I'm trying to keep some of the rhythm at least. And you, my Tagian nymphs, who have created in me new purpose with new genius firing, if 'twas my joy will e'er to celebrate your founts and stream my humble song inspiring. Oh, lend me here a noble strain elate, a style grandiloquent that flows untiring. So shall Apollo for your waves ordain ye, in name and fame ne'er envy Hippocrene. Grant me sonorous accents, fire abounding. Now serves ne presence pipe, ne lustic reed, but blast of trumpet, long and loud resounding, that flameth heart and hue to fiery deed. Grant me high strains to suit their guesties astounding, your sons, who aided Mars in martial need, that o'er the world be sung the glorious song, if themes so lofty may to verse belong. Yeah, it's really pretty when you can try to keep the rhythm up, but dense, obviously. All right, guys, thanks for checking out the show. If this is something you enjoyed, feel free to like, subscribe, all that good stuff. And I definitely recommend Blish's Black Easter. It's really unique and a really fun read. But until next time, happy reading.